During this lecture, I'm going to discuss teaching and learning. First, let's address what is learning. There are three definitions of learning up on the screen. The top coming from an animal behavior textbook, the middle one from a psychology textbook, and the last one and most succinct from a teaching textbook. What is common in all of these definitions? You should note the word change. Change is an important word in learning. Now again, this change is based on experience, whether it be in the classroom or otherwise, but it's a modification of what's already there. Now what is teaching or communication? More importantly, what is involved in teaching and communication, and why do we do it? Thinking about this, it's important to think about the role of the learner versus the teacher, or the role of the target, the person that you're trying to communicate to, and the person that's communicating. In education, we often talk about learner-centered pedagogy. And this is important because learning must be on the part of the learner. You cannot learn for somebody else. They must do so based on their own experiences. The quote on this screen comes from a former Rutgers faculty member, and that it's important for all of us to understand that when we think about the teacher at the front of the class, we often think about sort of our empty minds being filled and being directed by what's happening in the front of the class. Yet modern learning psychology tells us that, again, learning is based on change. It's taking what is being experienced and integrating it into a current network. This means that the brain isn't empty when it comes to class and needs to be filled by what the teacher intends to give to the learner, but rather the learner comes to the class rich with ideas and experiences. And the ideas that the teachers are working with often need to be integrated or woven into what's already in the brain. This means that what is being learned is different for every single learner. And what an individual understands is based on their previous experiences. The idea of taking what is being experienced and integrating it into a current network of knowledge in the brain is known as knowledge constructive or constructivism. This is an important idea for those of you who are looking to become formal classroom teachers in particular. So as we move back to what is learning, and as I mentioned, learning is basically change based on experience, we can think about the processes that occur when one learns. As a learner, there's some level of acquisition, there's some level of organizing ideas, there's some level of idea retention, and then we do something with those ideas. So for the purpose of this lecture, we're going to use a metaphor, that being one of a filing cabinet. For those of you who don't know, a filing cabinet is a structure that holds files or paperwork that is the basis of design for the files that are stored on your computer. On the top image, you can see that papers are being scattered about, not being organized in any folders and simply shoved into the drawer. However, in the second image, we can see that papers are organized in a folder and put in the drawer. And more importantly, at the third and highest level, papers are not only being placed in the folder, but they're being sorted based on different information that is labeled on the outside of the folder. In this way, a learner can think about what they know how they know it, and they know how to use that information. So let's put this metaphor to work. Okay, we can look at a basic learning cycle. This was taken from a standard teaching textbook. We know And for those of you who've had educational psychology or even general psychology, that there needs to be some kind of experience. This is often taken in through our sensory system. But then something happens in the brain, and those are what the next two steps are, if you can see here. Number one, the individual has to understand what is being taken into the brain. They have to make sense of it. But then, to be able to use the knowledge later, the individual needs to file that information or abstract it in such a way that when a new situation comes up, they can recall or use that information. And that situation in the form of a classroom is often dealing with some kind of test where there is some kind of physical or motor output. So, tying it all together, you can imagine the basic learning cycle as one where there's acquisition through some sort of sensory modality. They're seeing it, they're hearing it, they're experiencing it. Individuals often say that they're an auditory learner or they're a visual learner. We know certain ideas are learned best in certain ways, but that really we're using a combination of our senses all the time. Not only that, but we're relying on our social interactions, the individuals around us as well. But now, once we take information in, we make sense of it, we can put it in a folder, but what's really important in this phase is how do we label the folder so that when we need the information later, we know where to find it. And this is the process of abstracting, or making something general enough so that when you see a new situation, you know how to use it. And then, again, the motor or the testing, the output, is being asked to recall or pull something out or solve a problem, of which the information is pulled out of the brain, its individual files, and applied appropriately. This is what's known as the learning cycle. Again, sensory input, understanding comprehension, abstracting that filing portion, and then some level of output. Creating this experience in a course relies on not only providing actual and authentic experiences and various levels of assessment, but allowing the learner time to reflect and think about what and how one is learning alone and in groups, and then allowing them to think about how they'll use it subsequently. So if we apply our knowledge of the learning cycle and begin to think about best practices in teaching, we know that we need to consider prior knowledge. We know that we need to be thinking about in-depth thinking and encourage metacognition. You have an article that's assigned that will talk about these concepts in more detail, so you'll be able to apply them to the learning cycle. But in doing so, the educator, the instructor, the communicator needs to have a clear objective. What is it you're trying to do? What is your goal? What is it that you would like to see the learner say or do? And how will you know that they've done so? That's the assessment. That's a way of knowing if your goal is met. Often we think about quizzes and tests, but there are many, many forms of authentic assessment that can help learners learn and help educators understand what it is their learners have learned. Once you have that objective, once you have a sense of how you know they've met the objective, then we begin to plan what kinds of experiences we want to design for our learners. An excellent way to set goals or objectives is to think about Bloom's taxonomy. And that is to think about ways to get learners at this level. And so for your purposes in this course, I recommend using words or terms like these in your actual objectives. You'll also be given a list of words that we recommend for learning objectives. Beyond Bloom's taxonomy, there's another well-known example of learning objective terms that individuals can use by Wiggins and McTighe. For example, you might say not that you want the learner to learn the water cycle, because learn's too vague, but that a learner can explain the several stages of a water cycle. Perhaps they can interpret the outputs of the water cycle and apply these outputs to different scenarios. So in this way, we're using these types of terms to help define our objectives, or what is it we want to communicate or teach. Now, never use the word understand or learn. If your goal has the word understand or learn, it's probably too vague. It's not attainable for your learner. So we're going to continually push on you when you give us your goal to get more specific, get more detail, and really think about the output. How will you know that your communication or your teaching experience was successful? It's really important as we put together our ideas about learning that it isn't necessarily the idea that facts are brought in or obtained, but rather how they're using that information. So we not only want to engage our learners in what to think, but also how to think about it, because that's very important in helping them to be able to generalize ideas and use them in future scenarios. Now, what kinds of ways can we encourage that type of thinking? We can do things like promoting learners or encouraging learners to identify similarities and differences, which is fairly simple, right? They can think about something like ozone and how it can be good and bad in our atmosphere. You could also use concept maps, Venn diagrams, tables. There's many ways to encourage your learners or your targets to compare and contrast or identify similarities and differences that can help them engage in deeper thinking. Now, I've used this term quite a bit, the idea of abstract or abstraction. Again, this is an ability to generalize. So if we think about an example of a water bottle, you may have one near you on the table, on a desk. Now, there's a good chance that one of your water bottle doesn't exactly look like somebody else's who's also watching this video. How do you know it's a water bottle, though? Is it a specific color? Probably not. Is it a specific material? No, we know that there's lots of materials that water bottles are made from. But might it be a specific shape? Might it have certain features like a top or a way of containing liquid? Certainly. So those are the general principles of a water bottle. That it is a container that has some kind of seal to keep the liquid in. But the color, now that's not an important piece. That's not something that's generalizable. That's something that's specific to each and every water bottle you see. So again, when we think about the kinds of things we want to teach our learners or communicate, we want the ability to generalize, to pick out what's important in that context, file it in our minds, and then be able to use it later. Now, in your article, you are going to read about metacognition, and this is often a sticking point for many students. So metacognition basically is thinking about one's thinking, right? It's one level up of thinking. Now, there are several pieces to metacognition. Number one, and most common, is there's a self-knowledge piece. I know how I think about things. There is a sense of, when I'm trying to solve this problem, how and when do I use specific thinking strategies? And then more generally, what kinds of thinking strategies tend to help people think about this in a certain way or in another way? For example, in chemistry classes, often when dealing with molecules, students will be given a set of physical models, right? Now, you can take that model and you can use it to form whatever molecule or something like that that you may want. But you would be thinking metacognitively if you thought, how does this model that I'm using to think about molecules, how is it similar or different to the actual molecule? How is it helping me to learn? What features of this model is not applicable to the situation? Those kinds of questions are metacognitive questions. We'll work on it further in class, but I just wanted to give you some extra help in thinking about the term. You'll read about it much more in the article. So in summary, some great ways to really think about how you might structure your communication or teaching. You want learning to be active, right? You cannot learn on the part of a learner. That learner needs to actively be doing something and learning. And even if it's in a lecture, giving that learner something to do. There's no such thing really as passive learning, right? By our definition, learning is change, it's active. They can do things like compare and contrast or use metacognition or metacognitive strategies. You want to build on previous experiences that learners have. You want to integrate your material and mix it up. You want your ideas to be practical yet constructive. You want to have clear and attainable learning goals, right, to promote that understanding. And a great way to improve your teaching continually is to teach responsibly. That means that you are continually getting feedback from your learners, you're asking questions, and you're allowing them to help you shape your general practices based on their successes and failures. So again, we'll talk about this much more, and this is an area that you're going to have a lot of practice with. For those of you who are going to go on to become teachers, this is a very brief introduction. You're going to get a lot more detail in your subsequent courses. But for those of you who are going on into other fields and careers, this little crash course is to help you think about the strategies that successful educators and successful communicators use.